Now, in terms of a few concepts that we can start to have in mind as we continue through this study, there's lots of ones that we could add to this, but here's 10 that we can just be looking for, and ones that might eventually become the springboard for your thesis. Now, some of these could go together within an essay, but remember, you don't need to cover everything. So it's not like a marker is looking at your essay and going, have they covered absolutely every single theme within Eliot's poetry? Instead, you're looking to focus on a few that you feel like you can really do justice to. So the ones that we've listed up here connect very well to some of the ideas that we've been listening to from you guys already. So there's this degradation of the urban landscape, urban decay, the sordidness of the street, and as was mentioned just before, the way in which there is this infiltration of urban decay into these interior spaces, literally internalized into the individual. We've also got this concept that flows throughout Eliot's poetry about the futility of mundane existence. And a term that I often will come back to is ritual, social ritual. And that leads into this third point about the meaning and meaninglessness of ritual. I think for Eliot, when we consider his own religiosity, is someone who is maybe looking out at the modern world, one that is increasingly hedonistic and to some degree increasingly secular, and seeing that ritual, what once was a traditional religious form of devotion, perhaps the one form of repetition that gets more meaningful the more it's repeated, has been perverted here. And instead, in poems like Preludes and Prufrock especially, he skewers those empty social rituals that are designed to give modern life some meaning, but only perpetuate dislocation. There's also this idea that courses throughout Eliot's poetry about the soul. And that's something that I end up gravitating towards a little bit in my readings of Eliot's poetry, the commentaries that are being made from that religious stance about the soul. And I'm thinking about in poems like Preludes, where he talks about the 1,000 sordid images of which your soul was constituted. The idea that the soul can be corrupted. And to link it all together with what we established about urban landscapes, that just as the body is subject to the fragmentation and mechanization of the post-industrial world, so too is the soul subject to that same desecration. Also connecting to things that we've said already, there's this concept of the inability to connect with others and that paradox about urban society, where there's immense physical proximity, but immense emotional and spiritual distance between people. We've also had some allusions throughout our discussions about the misogyny that is there in Eliot's poetry and his moral puritanism, which again ties in with some of his religiosity. And therefore, there are these portraits in a lot of the poems about a certain frustrated masculinity. That's especially palpable within Prufrock as he is continuing this diatribe. Prufrock sounds like he is, almost like an incel in the way that he is lamenting his situation and providing this very intensive, very confronting diatribe. Now, as much as we can tend to get hung up on a lot of the hopelessness and the bleakness within Eliot's poetry, one thing that I think is also important to acknowledge is how much hope is there buried beneath the surface sometimes. I think in most of the poems, there is some glimmer of hope. Often it gets quite swiftly denied. So the hope that we might find in a poem like Preludes, as the first person speaker clings to the notion of that infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing, gets swiftly rejected by broader society. We might take a look at that anecdote or that vignette in closer detail later. But there is nonetheless a little bit of a hope for the possibility of spiritual renewal. The possibility that there can be some line that is rebuilt between the human and the divine, perhaps through prayer, perhaps through faith, religious devotion, committing to faith even when it is difficult and arduous and testing, the importance of perseverance as a way of gaining some spiritual renewal, I think is there within Eliot's poetry, especially something like Journey of the Magi. This leads into some of the concepts as well about damnation and salvation, the uncertain destination of the soul. We see that there's these motifs in Eliot's poetry in alluding to hell, heaven, purgatory, the way that Prufrock starts with that epigraph from Dante's Inferno, the way in which the Hollow Men is littered with allusions to Inferno and Paradiso, two of those books within Dante's Divine Comedy, and how Eliot is almost associating some of the religious concepts of damnation with earth as it is, especially in a post-war world, and whether the possibility of salvation does exist. And then finally, I think there's this concept that reverberates in Eliot's poetry about time and the nature of time, especially the paradoxical nature of time. Now, in something like Preludes, we see the circularity of time, we see the repetition of every day, but we also see time as being very fractured and broken. There's a little bit paradoxical there where it's circular and therefore quite linear and stable and predictable, but at the same time, we only get these fragments, these little snapshots of the day. Or in Prufrock, which I think evokes a paradoxical nature of time that probably still relates to us today, where the individual minutes and days are often very long and feel like they're being drawn out, but the years feel very fleeting. And there's this tension between, for Prufrock, how long every single minute feels, but how swiftly he is aging. So these are some of the concepts that I tend to gravitate towards in a discussion of Eliot's poetry. It's by no means limited to this set, but I think from here we can start to find a few good launch pads for a thesis.